Hey class, this is Professor Henson. We're going to talk about the Gospels today. We're going to talk about the initial formation of the Gospels. We're going to talk about an issue called the synoptic problem. And we're going to talk about the Gospel of Mark. But first off, let's talk about the different stages of the formation of the Gospel. And I'm kind of playing off of Raymond Brown's introduction to the Gospels. First off, we have the life and ministry and acts of Jesus Christ. You notice on the right side of the screen here where the cursor is where I'm kind of looking at the notes wise. Initially the first stage is the living, breathing Jesus. And things he did, the sayings, the healings, etc. A Jewish man who lived in Galilee and Jerusalem around the 20s or maybe 30s AD. The next stage is the apostolic preaching or oral phase. Essentially, you have a preaching where people would go out and they repeat these words of Jesus. They were passing them out to those around them, and you find that apostles do that in the book of Acts. And then we find the essentials of the gospel, the teaching of the teachings of Jesus, the death, the resurrection of Jesus, and they were all kind of condensed and distilled into forms easy to pass on orally. Remember, this is an oral society. Literacy was very low. Some scholars estimate maybe less than 10% of the people were able to read. Now, it depended on where you were in the Roman Empire. Literacy could be somebody being able to sign their name to a document, and that was considered literate. So the numbers are definitely not what we would find in the modern world. But orality was very important. Even those who could read, the written documents were to support the oral saying of a text or a document. They were living documents. And essentially the gospel is passed on by word of mouth, the best advertising, right? Different people would pass the story on differently, adapting it to their audience. And here's a quote here. If Jesus was a Galilean in the first third of the first century who spoke Aramaic, which I believe he may have spoke Aramaic and Greek, by mid-century his gospel being preached in diaspora to urban Jews and Gentiles in Greek, a language that he did not normally speak if he spoke it at all. So notice here my notes also say the essential message had been kind of condensed down, distilled down into kyrgyma, this preaching, this essentialness of the doctrine of Jesus. As 1 Corinthians 1:23, we preach Christ crucified. That's a very small kyrgymatic saying. Jesus died, was resurrected, and he, and rose again. That's the gospel. That's the distillation of the kyrgyma, the message, and that was passed on. Not only did you have preaching of the gospel, but you also have this liturgy and worship. Some of the sayings and teachings of Jesus had become written down and recorded and used in baptismal rites, Eucharist or Lord's Supper type formulas, even early catechesis. We find these things being passed along. In fact, the Christus hymnus in Philippians 2, some believe was an early hymn that Paul incorporated into his writings. Now, the written Gospels is kind of one of the last stages we find here, and according to Brown's schematic here. After being passed along orally, the stories were written down. The story of Jesus went through this oral shaping phase and eventually was written down. Kind of like if any of y'all take an Old Testament survey with Gardner-Webb or any other schools, most people still believe there was an oral phase to the Old Testament, especially the Torah, before it was written down in the text. Each gospel writer had their own little theological, I don't want to say agenda is a good word there, but it can be kind of loaded. Theological purpose they're trying to get across, and they present the tradition of Jesus in different ways, kind of depending on their audience and the needs of their audience. And I put in there, but weren't the gospel writers, at least John and Matthew, eyewitnesses? Well, if they just wrote what they saw, the chronology wouldn't it be all similar and everything else? Well, they're not really. John 2 reports the cleansing of the temple early in Jesus' ministry, but Matthew 21 has a temple cleansing at the end of Jesus' ministry. Some have reconciled us by saying there are two different temple cleansings. Here's a quote by Brown. Rather than depending on a personal memory of the events, each evangelist or gospel writer, remember evangelist or euangelion, good news there, has arranged the material he received in order to portray Jesus in a way that would meet the spiritual needs of the community to which he was addressing the gospel. And again, it's the gospel writers who possibly lived anywhere from maybe 30 to 40 years, maybe even 50 years after Jesus, writing down stories or having their writing secretary, we'll talk about when we get to Paul, writing secretaries write down these stories in a shape, in a form that is packaged for their audience. Their church in, say, Caesarea, or the church maybe in Rome, or the church in diaspora, whatever their audience was, depending on the gospel, it's packaged so as to do that. And one of the things we're going to talk about when we talk about Mark is how certain customs and languages and phrases are kind of translated into an audience that may have been in Rome. So things to think about there. But notice the Gospels are arranged in a logical order, not necessarily a chronological order. Now, this causes this notion of this kind of fluidity or non-chronological order, but logical order. This causes havoc with some people's notions of inspiration of the text, because we expect things to be literal. We expect things to be just as Jesus said them, in an order Jesus happened, because a lot of a very literalness to the notion of what Scripture is. Any question undermines it. But anyway, I won't go on that tangent as much as to say that this notion of the gospel writers packaging the audience, I don't think undermines Scripture. You see, there's issue what you think about when it comes to truth. And I note there, if the Gospels are not arranged in a chronological order, but shaped and edited, action criticism, one of the lectures, source criticism, then how, if these packages and shaped, how can be considered truth? Truth must be looked at in terms of intentions. And when you think about truth in way literalness, a modern sense of literalness, fact, data, that's not necessarily how they view truth in other contexts, especially in the ancient world. The intended purpose of the Gospels were to bring the readers to hearers to faith in Jesus. Their goal isn't faculty-based, it's strictly reported biography, but it's to present a view of Jesus, to bring people to Jesus. And since Gospel writers edit and tweak events from history, then how are faith people to still view the Gospels as word to us? Well, the Holy Spirit's guidance was involved in the process. And the finished product, I think, and as you notice the brown quote there and near the bottom of the page there, reflect the truth that God sent Jesus to proclaim. In other words, we have to have faith. This is the message that God wants us to hear. Now, I've got on the left side of the screen different passages in the Bible there. My technology's blinking there. But you'll notice there's columns here, and there's Mark, and there's Matthew, and my technology is wanting to work. Well. Anyway, one thing is that not every story that one gospel records and the other records as well. Here we go. Notice there are some things in Luke that aren't in Mark, and some things in Matthew, and there's some things in John that aren't in each. But one of the things we'll notice is, and if you'll notice at the bottom of the right side of the screen there, that there are 661 verses in Mark, 1,068 verses in Matthew, 1,149 in Luke. 80% of Mark's verses are reproduced in Matthew. 65% of Mark's verses are reproduced in Luke. Many call this the triple tradition, where Mark, Luke, and Matthew have something in common. There's also this notion of a double tradition where there's similarity between Matthew and Luke. There's not similarity in Mark. And one thing to keep in mind is there's similarity in wording amongst all these Gospels, these three Gospels. There's similarity in order. There's similarity in parenthetical material. Matthew 9:6, Luke 2:10, Mark 2:10, and Luke 5:24. Then he said to the paralytic, that's a parenthetical citation, it's in all three. There's also similarity in biblical quotations that don't necessarily match the Hebrew or the Septuagint. Mark 1:2, Matthew 3:3, Luke 5:24. So there's something going on with these documents. There's this notion of the synoptic Gospels. Now that Greek word synoptic, if you'll notice here at the bottom of the screen there, synoptic, probelm. Syn means together, optic was to see them together. The synoptic Gospels were supposed to, they're viewed together. Well, they look very similar. There's similarities. one of the passages we'll look at here in just a moment, as my technology decides to work, is Mark 3, 4 through 8, Luke 6, 9 through 11, and Matthew 12, 11. There's some similarities here. Notice that we've got Jesus and Matthew here. He left the place and entered their synagogue, and notice the parallel that he entered their synagogue, all three there. There's a man with a withered hands in all three. And there's this question of, is it lawful to do good or to cure on the Sabbath? Okay, and notice the highlights are so that. The so that phrase there is the same word in the Greek there. They might accuse, there's an accusation there. And Jesus tells a story in Matthew that's not necessarily in the others. Sheep there. But notice there's these similarities, and as I scroll across the passages, this neat little program I've got lights up the very similar or the same words that are in each. But notice also we get down there, there's different parts for different authors there. But notice you got stuff like stretch out your hand. It stretched out and it was restored. Those are almost word for word. It's almost like one person's looking off the other person's paper and copying. Scholars have come up with different theories about how to solve this. There's the Griesbach hypothesis that said, well, maybe Matthew wrote his gospel first. Luke had a copy of Matthew, or the oral tradition behind Matthew, when he wrote his gospel, and Mark used both of them. There's a few strengths to that. First off, they agree with church tradition. Matthew supposedly first, because Matthew was one of the disciples of Jesus, supposedly. Mark and Luke weren't. Luke was a physician. They have some relations to Paul. Mark had relations to Paul, but also had relations to Peter, and Peter supposedly passed on his gospel. Augustine or Augustine, however you want to pronounce that, depending whether you're Protestant or Catholic, said that Mark was an abridgment of Matthew. The second strength of the Griesbach hypothesis that says Matthew's first is it can explain all the agreements. It explains Markan redundancies. Mark repeats things sometimes. When evening came as the sun was setting, whereas Matthew says 8:16 when evening came, or Luke 4:40 says when the sun was setting. Mark may be conflated. May have conflated two different sources, keeping both readings. That's the redundancies there possibly. But here's some of the weaknesses. It does conflict with church tradition. Tradition says that Matthew was written in Aramaic and then translated into Greek, and it's clear that Matthew is not a translation from Aramaic into Greek. There are agreements that best can be explained by Markan priority. And Markan redundancies can be explained by Markan priority too. Of the 213 examples of redundancies, only 17 appear to be conflations. Now, another theory that kind of gets more traction in the scholarly world is that of the two-document hypothesis. Now, this one gives Markan priority. In other words, Mark was written first. It's the shortest gospel. It's more natural to think that Matthew and Luke would have added to the shortest gospel as opposed to Mark taking away from. Why would Mark delete great tomes like Sermon on the Mount or the birth? There is the Sermon on the Mount in both Luke and Matthew, and it's put it this way: Sermon on the Mount in Matthew, and especially in Matthew and Luke, is one of the most written about passages in all the Bible. That's important, but why would Mark admit that, right? If Mark wanted an abridged version, why just not make the story shorter? Another reason for Markan priority to think is also this notion that it's the poorest Greek of the Gospels. It's easier to think that Matthew and Luke improved on Mark's bad Greek. Mark has harder readings, more difficult readings, the things that Matthew and Luke may have smoothed out. For example, Mark 3, 4 through 8 has Jesus getting angry, while Matthew and Luke omit angry. It may have been troublesome for early Christians to think about Jesus getting angry at people. There's lack of verbal agreement in Matthew and Luke against Mark, lack of Matthew-Luke agreements in order against Mark. When Matthew differs from Mark's order, Luke never agrees with Matthew. When Luke differs from Mark's order, Matthew never agrees with Luke. And there's some literary agreements that are best explained by Markan priority. And I've got Matthew 27, 15 through 22, Mark 15, 6 through 13, Luke 23, 18 through 21. And Luke's abbreviated the Barnabas story by omitting tradition about releasing a prisoner. Another argument for marking priority is the argument for from redaction. It's easier to see that Matthew added the son of David motif as opposed to seeing Mark omitting it. Also, why would Luke and Mark omit this was to fulfill for Matthew? In other words, this argument is that there's certain attributes and certain motifs and certain characteristics, which I notice I misspelled motif, certain characteristics that were added to the text by these different gospel writers on top of a base text that may have been Mark. Mark's theology, number 8 there, Mark's theology is a little less developed. Mark calls Jesus Lord 6 times. Matthew does the same 6 plus 24 more. Another thing about this documentary hypothesis is this Q, this quella. The two document hypothesis claims that there was Mark or some document behind Mark was one of the sources for Matthew and Luke. And there's another source document called quella, or Q. That's a German word there. The scholars theorize we don't have this document. It only exists in theory. And some scholars have actually tried to make a theory there. Now, what is quella? What is Q? Well, there's passages that are in Matthew and Luke but aren't in Mark. So where did they come from? Well, scholars theorize that this Q is that source for those agreements between Matthew and Luke. Now, there's also some material that's not in Mark or Q, the shared document Q, that may be in Matthew. Well, the M source, Matthew source, Matthean source. There are some items in Luke that aren't in Mark or Q. They're probably Lucan sources. Now, all this discussion of the Gospels and all the sources and stuff, this is where ideas like source criticism, redaction criticism, some degree form criticism, all these things come into play because scholars have taken apart these texts and tried to understand, this problem. Why do they look alike? And they use these different tools to try to break the pieces down and pull things together and then put them back together and figure out what to do. These are theories, and some of you guys may, especially those that may have come from a more conservative Christian background, may find this challenging. But you have to ask the question, why the similarities? If they're all recording Jesus' life how it was, then there should be more agreement, and there shouldn't be so many differences as far as chronological order or quotations. There's got to be something else going on. And the hypotheses like the Griesbach hypothesis or two-document hypothesis, they try to give us some answer. Are these correct answers? No, I tend to side that the two-document hypothesis has a lot of credence. It's one of those things where when I get to heaven, and if I still care about it, I'll ask God, and He'll probably laugh and say it doesn't really matter. But some things to keep in mind. I just want you guys to be aware of the issue at play, that there's some similarity between these Gospels, and scholars have tried to explain why they're similar.